Last lecture, we saw a defense of the notion that government should exist. But few people today actually question the existence of the government, that it should exist as a given. Instead, they question its size. How big should the government be? And it's not just a question of what actions the government should or should not restrict, although we'll turn to that question next lecture. No, it's a question of how much the government should do. Should the protection the government provides only include physical safety, or should it also include economic protection? Does its task in protecting the natural right to life require it to ensure that everyone has the bare necessities of survival, food, shelter, and clothing? Does its role in protecting people from harm give it the right to keep people from producing unsafe products? Should it build roads and bridges and regulate industry to protect the environment? Should it guarantee an education and access to health care to every citizen? Should the government make sure that workers are treated fairly and paid a living wage? Should it ensure that everyone enjoys a fair or even equal share of the earth and society's resources? And how should it pay for it all? These are the questions that surround our modern debates on things like healthcare, the minimum wage, environmental regulation, infrastructure, education, welfare, and, of course, taxation. And usually, they're considered to be questions about economics. How much should the government interfere with the economy? What should the government be in the business of doing? But of course, this is a philosophy question as well. Economics is going to be an offshoot of philosophy. And to answer this question, what we're going to need to do is look at the three biggest names in economic theory: Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Maynard Keynes. Now, when it comes to economics, there's a common assumption made by most parties. The government should do whatever generates the best results, what is best for everyone overall. It's a kind of utilitarian assumption. The government should gauge its involvement based on what will produce the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, or, in economic terms, the most money for the most people. Later, we'll see philosophers be less concerned with such things and be more concerned with things like fairness or entitlement. But when it comes to the economic debate about big government, the disagreement centers around what effects government involvement will have on the economy. Now, any discussion of modern economics has to start with Adam Smith. You probably know him as the invisible hand guy. Just leave the market alone. The less interference, the better. Those who are fans of small government usually quote Smith with gusto. But when it comes to Smith, as it usually is with such things, the common popular understanding isn't exactly accurate. Smith's seminal 1776 work, The Wealth of Nations, is the most famous academic defense of capitalism. The idea that the economy should be dictated by the activity of private citizens rather than controlled by the government. But the kind of government overreach that Smith was concerned about isn't the kind that people usually complain about today. At the time, the dominant economic theory of mercantilism suggested that the best way to make a nation wealthy was for its government to protect its own merchants and industries. The government should tax and tariff competing foreign imports to death so as to give the local merchants a price-controlling monopoly, thus keeping the nation's money inside of the country. But to Smith, this was the wrong way to think about national wealth, and all such efforts did was set the price of goods so high that most people couldn't afford them. The real key to national wealth, Smith argues, is competition. If you let producers and businesses, both foreign and domestic, compete, you provide them with an incentive to keep their prices down. If your prices are lower than your competitor, people will buy your stuff instead of theirs. This makes the goods more affordable, which means more people will buy them. This increases demand for the product, which will force businesses to use division of labor and other industrial methods, which were new at the time, to produce more products more quickly. It will also drive innovation. To make money, people will invent new useful things for others to buy. All of this will create more jobs, increase the spending power of the consumer even more, and thus enable them to buy even more goods. This will again increase production, which will create even more jobs, etc., etc., etc. And when a nation's citizens are employed, have more money, and more access to always improving goods, that, Smith says, is how you measure the wealth of a nation. Now, this may seem obvious to us now, but it was a pretty new idea in 1776. The Dutch had already had some success with it, and the French physiocrats at the time were talking in terms of laissez-faire, or let it be. But overall, it was Smith's wealth of nations that played the most important role in capitalism's takeover of the developed world. Now, Smith wasn't defending economic liberty simply because he thought it was a natural right, that we had a natural right to that kind of liberty. No. Smith was much more utilitarian. He thought that capitalism was the most effective way to generate happiness, to raise the standard of living for everyone, both rich and poor. This is where his concept of the invisible hand comes in. He admitted that in a capitalistic system, everyone is just acting out of self-interest. They do what they want to do to get more money, not to better society. But, Smith argues, the interaction of everyone freely acting in their own self-interest actually works to the betterment of all, as if the entire process were guided by an invisible hand. Try to engineer an economy to benefit all, and you'll just fail. But just let the economy be, and let everyone act selfishly, and it will produce universal opulence. Some will be richer than others, of course, but everyone will be better off, Smith argues. This was not fallacious thinking. Recall that a whole can have properties that its individual parts lack. So a collection of individual actions, each aimed at benefiting a single person, could collectively benefit everyone. Interestingly, Smith's idea that order could emerge from disorder served as an inspiration for Darwin's theory of natural selection. But because Smith was interested in results and not just the production of individual liberty at all costs, Smith was more than happy to admit capitalism's shortcomings, to identify what was not suited for production by the free market, and to recommend government action and interference where it was needed. And this is what those who quote Smith today usually fail to recognize. Now, some of his suggestions aren't that surprising. Although it needs them to function, the free market can't produce a military or a police force or a just legal system. The government needs to do that, Smith says. But he also suggests that the government have access to what we today would call utilities and infrastructure. Roads, bridges, the water supply. Today, he might even include electricity and even the internet. Pretty much anything businesses need to function and transport their goods or provide their services, that's something that Smith says the government should probably provide. And Smith also called for government regulation of any industry that tended toward monopoly, like the financial system of banks and insurance companies, which, if they got too big, would be in a position to harm the public. But perhaps most surprisingly, he suggested the government pay for all of this with a progressive tax, where the more you earn, the greater percentage of your money would be used to fund the government. Usually it's Republicans that invoke Adam Smith today, but if you ask me, he sounds a lot like a modern Democrat. He even called for government-funded education. One of his biggest worries about capitalism was worker alienation. The division of labor necessary to increase production called for workers to perform the same task repetitively on an assembly line over and over and over. This can have a very negative effect on the worker and in turn on society as a whole. It's not only boring, but because it divorces the worker from the final product, it can be dehumanizing. This worried Smith. Smith's solution to this was education, publicly funded education. An educated person, Smith thought, is the kind that has the mental fortitude to survive working in a factory. And so, that's how big Adam Smith thought government should be and how he thought capitalism would lead to universal opulence. But since Smith's theory makes this prediction, his theory is testable. Does unregulated market competition really make everyone better off? After capitalism had a time to set in places like France and England and the United States, it became quite clear that the answer was no. Not only did worker alienation remain a problem, but since their goal was profits, capitalists paid their workers as little as they possibly could. And since there was an abundance of workers and the division of labor did not require workers to have that high of a skill level, capitalists could get away with paying them very little. And since things like safety inspections and vacation time and breaks and days off of work would just cut into profits, they didn't exist. So people were working long days in unsafe, unsanitary conditions all year round with no break or relief in sight for literally pennies a day. What was called subsistence wages, just enough to keep the worker alive and able to work. It wasn't this awful everywhere, but it was a far cry from the universal opulence that Smith had promised. And that brings us to our next economist, Karl Marx, because no one objected to the horrors of capitalism, including worker alienation, more fervently than Marx. Now, just like with Smith, the popular conception of Marx is not exactly accurate. Because of things like anti-communist propaganda during the Cold War, when you think of Marx, you probably think of Siberian gulags or that stone-cold boxer from Rocky IV. In reality, Marx would never have endorsed gulags or thought it necessary to break you. He was not the devil that he's often made out to be. His philosophy was simply a reaction to the horrors of industrial capitalism that he had witnessed. In fact, his attitude towards capitalism was not unlike that of the author of one of the most beloved stories of all time, Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. Like Dickens, Marx saw the plight of the poor as something created by greedy Scrooge-like capitalists. The liberty defended by Locke and Smith had simply become the liberty of rich business owners to oppress their workers. Or as Marx put it, the liberty of the bourgeoisie to oppress the proletariat. It was not liberty for all. But Marx didn't consider himself a philosopher. He considered himself a social scientist who was trying to describe social progress and how society works. He was trying to articulate what the abuses of capitalism were going to lead to, a communist revolution. In the same way that slavery had given rise to feudalism, which in turn had led to capitalism, Marx said that capitalism would eventually lead to socialism, which in turn would lead to communism. And since all such transformations result from economic class struggle, and since communism would be classless, Marx believed that communism would mark the end of social progress. But how would capitalism lead to communism? Well, Marx argued, since capitalism survives by exploiting the workers, they would eventually revolt. They would realize that the capitalists were thieves. To make a profit, the capitalists were paying them less than what their labor was worth. According to Marx's labor theory of value, if people will buy the product of a worker's labor for $100, then that's what their labor is worth. When the capitalist only pays them $50 and then charges $100, so pays them only $50 for their labor but charges $100 for the product, to make a profit on the sale, they're stealing $50 from the worker. And as competition increases, the exploitation will only worsen Monopolies will appear and prices will rise, which while wages decrease, this will create more working poor and even fewer jobs. Wealth will concentrate in fewer and fewer people, while the poor will just get poorer and poorer and poorer, and eventually the workers will snap and revolt. This revolt will lead to communism in fairly short order, Marx says. First, the workers will take control of the government and purge capitalism from the system, making the government socialist. It will take over the production of goods and all industry. But the structure of that government will eventually just dissolve. There will be no more need for a leader or for elected officials because the people will take control of all political decisions and the economic life of the country directly. And when they do, they'll ensure that there will be no more worker exploitation, no more worker alienation, and certainly no more child labor. All credit and banking will be done by the state, as will all means of communication and transportation. Anyone who can work will, they might even do multiple jobs throughout the day, and the profits of all labor will be shared by everyone. In fact, there will be such an abundance that everyone will have access to what the labor of the workers produces. Everyone will be guaranteed income, free education, and free medical care. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's Marx's communism. Now, of course, Marx wasn't really just a social scientist describing what he thought was going to happen. He was also a revolutionary. He was trying to make this happen. This is why, at the end of the Communist Manifesto, he called the workers of the world to unite. Communism described how big he thought government should be. Just like Smith, he was concerned with guaranteeing the greatest good for the greatest number. He just thought it had to be accomplished in an entirely different way. Only a system that regulated the economy heavily, that guarded against the dangers of capitalism, and that distributed the resources of society equally could really accomplish this. But was he right? Should government actually be this big? As you probably know, Marx's theory wasn't exactly vindicated in the long run. As Homer Simpson once said, "In theory, communism works. In theory." In reality, not so much. What went wrong? Well, first, it's well known today that his labor theory of value is wrong. Although, to be fair, it was the standard theory at the time. Smith accepted it as well. Much more than the cost of labor determines the value of a product. A product's utility, supply and demand, and a host of other factors are also relevant. Otherwise, how does the price of oil fluctuate so consistently? What's more, Marx failed to take into account that capitalists are owed some compensation for their efforts. Not only do they do the legwork to create the business in the first place, but they take financial risks that workers do not. After all, there's no guarantee the product will sell. So, contrary to Marx's suggestion, charging more than it costs to make something does not always amount to theft, the kind of theft that he thought motivated and justified a worker revolution. More importantly, many of Marx's predictions were just flat out wrong. For example, he said communism would first arise in the most developed nations. It did not. The most famous communist revolution happened in Russia in 1917, when Russia's economy was extremely primitive. And most developed nations never saw a communist revolt at all. Right? Although, to be fair, I've often wondered if Marx wasn't, well, instead of a self-fulfilling prophet, a kind of self-refuting prophet. Maybe capitalism was on the verge of collapse into communism in developed nations, but when the capitalists got wind of Marx's predictions, they placated their workers to prevent the revolt. This is why they gave them slightly higher wages, vacation time, improved working conditions, and eventually a 40-hour work week. Now, of course, this is far too simplistic. The history of labor laws is far, far more complex. But maybe, just maybe, if Marx hadn't said anything, the communist revolt would have happened in the developed countries. Maybe the very existence of his predictions is what made them fail. Regardless, where communism did arise, it didn't produce the worker-run state utopia of equality and plenty that Marx envisioned. The horror suffered by the poor under capitalism pale in comparison to the horrors suffered under Stalin's communist Russia and Pol Pot's Cambodian communist regime. As noble as his intentions might have been, Marx's utopian vision of society may have led to more suffering than any other philosophical idea in history. Communism wasn't the final stage in social progress. Most of the nations that experienced a communist revolution eventually collapsed, like the Soviet Union in 1991. And those that remain today are either infused with capitalism, like China, or are dismal failures, like North Korea, where the communist dictator lives in luxury, but the majority of people struggle to survive. Now, in defense of Marx, one might insist that these states were not truly Marxist. In fact, during his life, Marx distanced himself from almost every country that tried to implement his ideas. He even once famously insisted that he himself was not a Marxist. That is, that most people who said they were Marxist were actually failing to properly follow his theory. He probably would have said the same thing about the communist regimes that he didn't live to see. For example, Marx was not fond of religion. Yet in each of the previously mentioned examples, devotion and loyalty to the government was turned into a religion. According to the National Geographic documentary Inside North Korea, today in communist North Korea, Kim Jong-un is literally worshipped as a god, and complaining about his government can garner life imprisonment for you and your family in a concentration camp. But we have to be careful here. Defending Marx on the grounds that Marxist states aren't truly Marxist sounds like an ad hoc, untestable excuse. It's a bit like the no true Scotsman fallacy. If you say, no Scotsman lies, and then I find you a counterexample, a Scotsman who does lie, you can't rightly defend your position by saying, but he's not a true Scotsman. I could bring you 100 lying Scotsmen, and you could just still insist that no Scotsman lies because, none of them are true Scotsmen. If finding lying Scotsmen can't prove that your statement is wrong, nothing could until your statement is irrationally unfalsifiable. In the same way, if the failure of multiple communist states, all inspired by Marx, can't prove that Marx was wrong, what could? But they aren't true Marxist states. This excuse threatens to make Marxism unfalsifiable and thus basically a kind of pseudoscience. The same, in fact, can be said about other parts of Marx's theory. Marx predicted that capitalism would inevitably collapse into communism. But if the continued existence of capitalist economies doesn't prove him wrong, what could? Of course, no matter how long capitalism survives, you could always say that its downfall is right around the corner, but then it's like predicting the end of the world. People have been saying that the end is just around the corner for over 3,000 years, and yet here we still are. It's the perfect untestable excuse. Okay, so given all of this, it's probably safe to say that the government shouldn't be as big as Marx suggested. But that doesn't reduce the cogency of his critique of capitalism. People were still working in deplorable conditions for pennies a day. And even once labor laws were passed and working conditions were improved, it was still widely acknowledged that capitalism gave rise to two major problems. The first was simply economic inequality. The disparity between the rich and the poor was ever increasing in capitalistic societies. Money collected at the top and tended to stay there. Such disparity led to the Gilded Age, when rich capitalists like Cornelius Vanderbilt made so much money by paying his immigrant rail workers pennies a day that the walls in the library of his 70-room breaker's mansion were covered with walnut paneling and literally gold embossed leather. And such wealth wasn't ever distributed. It was just passed from generation to generation. A new income tax in 1909 helped rectify that somewhat, but income equality is still a problem today, and we'll talk about that in a couple of lectures. But the second problem was this: capitalism was unstable. It inevitably caused economic crashes, panics, recessions, and depressions. The most famous, of course, is the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression of the 30s. But capitalism, since its founding, has always had this problem, especially in the US. The first such problem happened as early as 1797 and was followed by others in 1807 and 1815 through 21, and 1837, and 1857, and 1873, and 1893, and 1907, and 1920-21. But it was the Great Depression that motivated a new kind of economics that gave a new kind of answer to how big government should be, an answer that came from the economist John Maynard Keynes. Now, it's important to realize that Keynes wasn't just worried about the stability of capitalism. He was living through the Great Depression, which, you'll recall, went on for years and years. It seemed as if there was no end in sight, and that was exactly Keynes' worry. He thought the Great Depression might be permanent. Left to itself, capitalism might never correct it. And so, Keynes argued, the government needed to step in to rectify the problem. How? Well, before Keynes, it was commonly thought that unemployment was always voluntary. Production and consumption would always, it was thought, naturally balance out so that there could be the same number of people buying things as there was making them. So employment could always be 100%. If you weren't working, it could only be because you were lazy and refused to work. But the Great Depression made this notion impossible to defend. There were literally thousands of people who would gladly have taken any job offered them, but there were just no jobs to be found. What had happened, Keynes suggested, was that, contrary to the prevailing theory, production had outstripped consumption. There was more supply than demand. Thus, there was no need for workers to produce more products, and thus no jobs were to be had. Although this made goods cheap, so few had the money to buy them, because few people had jobs, that there was no way to bring the supply back down to balance things out again. But this, Keynes thought, revealed the solution. If the problem is too much supply without the means to buy, then just give the people the means to buy the supply. This will increase demand and the system will balance out again. But how do you give people the means to buy the supply? Well, government intervention. To end the Depression, Keynes argued that the government needed to A, lower interest rates on loans to give the public greater access to funds, and B, to spend money, especially on infrastructure, to create jobs and thus give people money to spend. He didn't actually suggest the government pay people to dig holes and then fill them up again, but he did suggest that doing so, or something very much like it, would be preferable to doing nothing. Giving people an income was key to ending the Depression. Now, as far as I know, no one in the government ever did exactly what Keynes suggested, specifically because he suggested it. But many thought that Keynesian economics was vindicated after World War II. Fighting the war required the kind of huge government spending Keynes was calling for. And it seemed to not only end the Great Depression, but was followed by one of the biggest economic booms in American history. As you might have recognized, Keynes is a kind of middle ground between Smith and Marx. Keynes didn't think that the government should be involved in the economy to the extent that Marx did, and he recognized the flaws in Marx's theory. And while he agreed with Smith about many of capitalism's virtues, he disagreed about its stability and its ability to guarantee positive outcomes without interference. So Keynes is like Smith with a little infused Marxism. And so we might say that the answer to our question, how big should government be, is somewhere in between Smith and Marx. We don't want communism, but we don't want complete unregulated capitalism either. Now, I'm not saying that Keynes was exactly right and the debate about economics is over. The stagnation of the 1970s, when both unemployment and inflation rose, contradicted Keynesian models. And I also think he was wrong about the paradox of thrift. People saving money is not necessarily bad for the economy. What's more, Keynes might not have been concerned enough about the long-term consequences of the actions he suggested. When pressed about the fact that in the long run his policies might have negative effects, he famously dismissed such concerns because, quote, well, in the long run, we're all dead. What I'm saying is that the answer to our big question about the size of government, and ultimately all the smaller economic questions I raised at the beginning of the lecture about industry and regulation and healthcare, etc., should simply be this. Government intervention is good for some things and not for others. And we'll have to figure out which is which on a case-by-case basis. Simply saying, as people often do, that government should be bigger or that government should just be smaller, that kind of thinking that government intervention is always good or is always bad, is just too simplistic. Thinking that unregulated capitalism will always produce the best results for everyone leads to things like the financial crash of 2008. Some level of government involvement and regulation is necessary to save capitalism from itself. But thinking that every time the government interferes with the economy, things will turn out for the best is equally naive. The Cash for Clunkers program, for example, is widely thought by many to have caused more harm than good. We simply need to look at the results of government action and inaction and figure out what works best in each situation. Now, this may seem really obvious, but accepted answers to these questions remain elusive because people ignore such evidence in favor of a dogmatic devotion to their economic theory of choice. Worse yet, such devotion causes them to cherry-pick evidence and distort statistics. With enough creative finagling, you can make economic data support just about any theory you like. If we're really going to discover the truth, though, we have to be good philosophers. We have to guard against things like confirmation bias and availability error and admit when we are wrong, when our economic theory didn't get it right. But even discovering such answers really only answers half of our question about how big government should be. We have yet to discuss the level to which the government should interfere with our lives, what kinds of actions it should restrict or not restrict. What should we have the liberty to do? So now we must ask, what are the limits of liberty?